On January 19, 2008, 16-year-old Marlissa Wells agreed to see her boyfriend while her grandparents were away from home. She genuinely thought they were meeting to discuss their future together. Instead, investigators say that the encounter ended in one of the most horrific murders that Cobb County had ever witnessed in its history. What unfolded inside that home would reveal a hidden relationship, a young girl confronting a deeply life-altering choice, and a tragedy that permanently transformed two families. On this episode of Black Girl Gone, I share the story of 16-year-old Marlissa Wells, who was killed inside her hostile Georgia home, and the investigation that revealed the heartbreaking truth about what took place inside that house. This is Marlissa's story. Every family eventually reaches a moment when the child they've spent years protecting starts seeking a little more freedom, greater independence, and increased personal privacy at home. For Charles and Gloria Wells, that was the stage they had reached with their beloved granddaughter, Marlissa. They trusted the young woman she was becoming, and they felt they had prepared her to make wise choices and handle the challenges that come with adolescence. Yet they could not have known that someone had already entered Marlissa's life who would exploit that trust. In January 2008, the 16-year-old Marlissa Wells lived with her grandparents in hostile Georgia, a suburb just west of Atlanta. Born in 1991, Marlissa had spent nearly all of her life being raised by her grandparents, Charles and Gloria, who gave her a stable, caring home. Their bond was close, unlike many grandparents raising teenagers. They worked to balance giving Marlissa sufficient freedom to mature, while also making certain she remained committed to school and away from trouble. By every known account, Marlissa was an intelligent, courteous young woman. At first, she attended Covenant Christian School, then eventually transferred to South Cobb High School, where she was recognized as a strong student and an active member of the school's marching band. Friends and relatives described her as caring, humorous, and approachable. Her warm personality naturally attracted people to her wherever she went. Beyond her school life, Marlissa participated in her church, where she regularly sang with the choir. She also deeply loved singing. It was a passion of hers, and those who knew her fondly called her a beloved songbird. She also genuinely enjoyed spending time with her close friends and family members. And like many other 16-year-olds, she was starting to discover the excitement and difficulties that naturally come with growing older and entering adolescence. She was gaining independence, planning for tomorrow, and handling the realities of her first serious relationship. Yet, to her grandparents, Marlissa still remained their little girl, and they believed they knew where she went, who she spent time with, and the types of choices she was making at that stage in her life. They had no reason whatsoever to suspect she was concealing anything from them. But privately, Marlissa had started a relationship that she deliberately kept hidden from her grandparents. Charles and Gloria loved Marlissa deeply, and like many grandparents raising a teenage daughter, they were protective of her. They firmly felt school should always come first, and they worked tirelessly to give Marlissa the structure, support, and direction they believed she needed to succeed. Dating, particularly at the age of 16, wasn't permitted, and Marlissa knew her grandparents would never accept her having a boyfriend. So, when she quietly started seeing someone, she kept that relationship mostly and privately to herself. For Marlissa, it may have simply seemed far easier to conceal that part of her life than disappoint the two people who had raised her. But hiding the relationship also meant those who cared about her. Most had little understanding of what was unfolding in her life, or the influence that relationship may have been beginning to exert on her. Marlissa met then 17-year-old Matthew Wilkins while they were both students at Covenant Christian School. They first became acquainted through school, and gradually their friendship naturally grew into a relationship. Like many teenage couples, they enjoyed being together, talking on the phone, and learning more about each other. From the outside, there seemed to be nothing particularly unusual about their relationship. They were simply two teenagers experiencing what felt like their first love. But for Marlissa, dating wasn't something she could openly discuss with her family. Because she knew her grandparents would strongly disapprove, she carefully balanced her feelings for Matthew against the expectations of those who had raised her. As the months slowly passed, concealing that secret became increasingly difficult. When Matthew graduated from Covenant Christian School in 2007, their relationship moved into another, very different chapter. He had earned a basketball scholarship to Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College, commonly known as ABAC, and relocated to Tifton, Georgia, roughly 3 hours south of Austell, Georgia. For many high school couples, that sort of distance might have ended the relationship, but it didn't for Marlissa and Matthew. Instead, they continued talking, using phone calls and texts to remain connected as Matthew gradually settled into college life, while Marlissa continued to stay in high school. Whenever Matthew eventually came home, the two carefully arranged to spend private time together, carefully keeping their relationship hidden from Marlissa's grandparents. But Marlissa wasn't the only person concealing things, because while continuing his relationship with Marlissa, Matthew had also started publicly dating another young woman after arriving at ABAC. Unlike his relationship with Marlissa, which had mostly stayed hidden because of her grandparents' rules, this new relationship was openly public. Friends and classmates at college already knew the pair were dating, while back home, Matthew continued his relationship with Marlissa. Exactly how those two relationships overlapped remains uncertain to this day. It's also still uncertain whether Marlissa knew Matthew was seeing someone else while he was away at college. There is no public evidence clearly showing that she knew about their relationship, or, if she did, how it might have affected their relationship. What is certain is that despite the physical distance and whatever complications existed between them, Matthew and Marlissa stayed in contact, and before long, their relationship would take a turn neither could ignore. By early January 2008, despite the distance separating them, Marlissa and Matthew were still seeing each other whenever he returned home. Around that same time in January, Marlissa missed her period, and she started seriously worrying that she could be pregnant. Unsure how to respond to the situation, she confided in Matthew, telling him she believed she might actually be pregnant. For two teenagers, now 16 and 19, the possibility of pregnancy was completely life-changing for them at that point in their lives. Matthew had only just recently begun college at ABAC, where he was playing basketball on a scholarship. According to testimony and statements from friends, he was deeply concerned about what a pregnancy could possibly mean for his future. Several people later told investigators that Matthew had expressed that he didn't want a baby and worried about how becoming a father might affect his plans, his future, and his opportunities. But while Marlissa was trying to come to terms with the possibility that she was pregnant, Matthew was confiding in his friends about his growing fears. The two teenagers were facing the same situation, but they were not facing it in the same way at all. As the reality of a possible pregnancy began to set in, it became clear that Marlissa and Matthew were no longer on the same page. Matthew wanted her to end the pregnancy, but Marlissa had already made up her mind. If she was pregnant, she intended to keep the baby, despite knowing that it would mean telling her grandparents about both the pregnancy and the relationship that she had kept hidden from them. So, on the morning of January 19, 2008, Marlissa Wells spent the early part of the day at home with her grandfather, Marvin. The two were very close, and that morning they found themselves talking openly about Marlissa's future and the life she hoped to build. And like many grandparents, Marvin enjoyed hearing his granddaughter dream about what might come next for her. Marlissa spoke about her hopes of eventually attending college and building a career as a professional singer-songwriter. As they talked about the future, another conversation was unfolding, however, throughout the morning. Marlissa had remained in contact with Matthew through phone calls and text messages. Having driven home from Tifton, where he was attending school, Matthew had made plans to meet Marlissa later that day so they could talk together in person. And later that morning, Marvin and Charlotte Wells had plans to attend the funeral of a close family friend. Confident that their granddaughter would be fine for a few hours, they left Marlissa there at the house by herself, expecting to return later that afternoon. Instead, while they were away, Matthew went to the Wells' home. Sometime after Marvin and Charlotte departed for the funeral, Matthew Wilkins arrived at the house, where Marlissa had been waiting for him. Now, exactly what the two discussed during their time together is still completely unknown. But eventually, their conversation became deadly. Matthew launched a vicious assault on Marlissa, stabbing her repeatedly and then repeatedly smashing her head against the porcelain toilet inside the bathroom. The attack continued when he forced a metal fork into her back, causing Marlissa catastrophic injuries. When the brutal assault was over, Matthew fled the house, leaving Marlissa alone inside and dying. In a matter of only minutes, the future Marlissa and her grandfather had discussed just hours earlier had been stolen away from her. The young woman who dreamed of attending college and pursuing a career in music was left struggling for her life inside the home where she had always felt secure. The brutality inflicted upon Marlissa was devastating, and before the day ended, her family would have to face a tragedy they never could have imagined. The events inside the Wells' home that afternoon would need to be pieced together as investigators tried to determine how an ordinary Saturday had descended into such unimaginable violence. On January 19, 2008, 16-year-old Marlissa Wells was viciously attacked and murdered inside the hostile Georgia home she shared with her grandparents. When they arrived home that afternoon, they encountered a scene no family member should ever have to see. When Marvin and Charlotte Wells arrived back home that afternoon, they expected their granddaughter to be exactly where they had left her only hours earlier. Instead, they encountered silence, and while moving through the house, they called out for Marlissa, but she didn't answer. It wasn't long before they discovered the unthinkable. Marlissa had been savagely murdered inside the bathroom in the home's basement. In an instant, an otherwise ordinary Saturday had turned into every family's worst nightmare. As the shock began to sink in, emergency responders were summoned to the residence, while investigators with the Cobb County Police Department promptly launched what would rapidly become a full homicide investigation into the death. Detectives immediately began trying to establish who had killed Marlissa, what had motivated the crime, and why she had been deliberately targeted that day. While emergency personnel worked inside, officers secured the property and placed a perimeter around the Wells residence. A quiet neighborhood only hours earlier had suddenly become an active homicide crime scene. Crime scene investigators methodically recorded each room before focusing their attention on the basement bathroom, where much of the assault had taken place. They photographed the area, gathered biological evidence, and safeguarded anything that might help reconstruct Marlissa's final moments. As they examined the home, investigators documented the serious injuries Marlissa had sustained, including multiple stab wounds and severe blunt force trauma, as well as the metal kitchen fork that had been driven into her body during the assault. Each piece of evidence recovered that afternoon would prove especially vital to identifying the person ultimately responsible for Marlissa's murder. While crime scene investigators continued examining the house, detectives interviewed Marlissa's grief-stricken grandparents and other relatives, seeking to piece together her final hours. Charles and Gloria Wells accounted for their whereabouts that morning, explaining that they had gone to the funeral, and when questioned, they also told investigators they did not know whether Marlissa had secretly been dating anyone at all then. However, as detectives expanded their interviews to Marlissa's friends and extended relatives, an entirely different and previously hidden picture of her private life began slowly emerging. Several individuals disclosed that Marlissa had secretly been dating Matthew Wilkins. One particular conversation, however, immediately drew the attention of investigators. Marlissa's cousin told detectives she had talked with Marlissa on Friday evening, January 18th. During that conversation, Marlissa privately confided that she believed she was pregnant and specifically named Matthew as the father of the baby. She also told her cousin Matthew intended to come to her grandparents' house the next day, so the two could privately discuss the pregnancy together face to face. To investigators, that information provided both a possible motive and the identity of the last known person expected to see Marlissa alive. Once Matthew Wilkins had been identified as a person of interest, detectives acted swiftly. While crime scene investigators continued processing the Wells' residence, detectives obtained emergency records from both Marlissa's and Matthew's cell phones, seeking to trace their movements and communications that day. Those records quickly became especially important because investigators found that Marlissa and Matthew had exchanged dozens of calls and text messages with each other on the day she was murdered. Cell-side data also showed Matthew's phone connecting with towers near the Wells' residence around the time investigators believed Marlissa had been killed, placing him roughly 1.5 miles from the house. When detectives initially spoke to Matthew, however, he denied seeing Marlissa that day. Matthew told investigators he had not been in Austell and insisted he had not been anywhere close to the Wells' home. By then, though, detectives already possessed substantial evidence that directly challenged and contradicted his story. Cell phone records had placed Matthew near the Wells' residence, directly contradicting the account he had given investigators. Armed with those findings, detectives obtained a search warrant for Matthew's parents' home in Douglasville, believing the evidence there could help establish precisely what had occurred inside the Wells' home that afternoon. In the early morning hours of January 20th, less than 24 hours after Marlissa's body was found, investigators carried out the search warrant at Matthew Wilkins' parents' home. As detectives searched the residence, they carefully gathered anything they believed might be directly related to the case and the ongoing investigation. One discovery, however, immediately drew particular attention. During the attic search, an investigator spotted a bundle of clothing hidden behind an HVAC unit. Concealed from plain sight, the bundle held several pieces of clothing, including a pair of sneakers. Investigators removed the items carefully and quickly noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the shoelaces. The evidence was gathered and sent for forensic testing. In total, 19 bags of evidence were ultimately removed from the Wilkins home. After investigators had secured the evidence, they arrested Matthew Wilkins at his parents' home. Within 24 hours of Marlissa's killing, the 19-year-old had been taken into custody. While detectives continued developing their case, the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office performed Marlissa's autopsy, documenting the complete extent of the violence she had suffered. The examination showed that Marlissa had been stabbed more than 60 times, with most of the wounds centered around her head and neck. Along with those stab wounds, the medical examiner recorded extensive blunt force trauma injuries consistent with her head being repeatedly slammed against a hard surface, highlighting the extreme violence used during the attack. The autopsy yielded significant forensic evidence, but perhaps its most surprising finding concerned the very issue investigators believed had prompted the murder. Although Marlissa believed she was pregnant, and although she and Matthew had been discussing that possibility during the days before her death, the medical examiner found no indication that she was actually pregnant. Whether Marlissa had suffered a delayed period or simply misread signs of pregnancy cannot be known, but it remains clear that Marlissa and Matthew both believed she was pregnant, and that belief had already triggered the tragic events that followed. With Matthew Wilkins behind bars, the case shifted from investigation into the courtroom. On April 4, 2008, a Cobb County grand jury officially indicted Wilkins for malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and aggravated battery, and he stayed jailed without bond while prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared for trial. Although his arrest came less than 24 hours after Marlissa's murder, taking the case to trial would require substantially more time. Investigators had gathered a large quantity of physical evidence, much of which needed lengthy forensic examination before being introduced in court. DNA recovered from the crime scene, biological samples, and items taken during the search of Wilkins' parents' home all required analysis and comparison. a process that alone took months to finish. By the time the case was ultimately ready for trial, over 2 years had elapsed since Marlissa lost her life. Matthew Wilkins' trial finally began in March 2010 at Cobb County Superior Court. Throughout the proceedings, Marlissa's relatives filled the courtroom, taking several rows in the gallery as they listened to testimony concerning the last hours of her life. Prosecutors carefully laid out the evidence they had spent more than 2 years gathering. Jurors heard testimony concerning the dozens of calls and messages Marlissa and Matthew exchanged on the day of the killing, cell phone records placing him near the Wells' residence, and DNA evidence establishing that the pair had engaged in sexual intercourse. Shortly before Marlissa was killed, prosecutors also presented the blood-stained clothes and sneakers found in the attic of Wilkins' home, evidence they argued connected him directly to the killing. The defense, however, maintained that Matthew was innocent, continuing to claim that he had never been inside the Wells' home on January 19th, despite the physical and digital evidence introduced by the state. As witnesses gave testimony and graphic crime scene photographs were displayed for jurors, courtroom observers noted that Wilkins remained largely emotionless and expressionless throughout much of the proceedings. The courtroom remained focused on the evidence as both sides presented their arguments, while Marlissa's family continued listening to the testimony surrounding her final hours and the circumstances that had ultimately led to her tragic death that day. On March 10, 2010, following roughly 5 hours of deliberation, the jury finally delivered its verdict. Matthew Wilkins was convicted on every count presented to them. During Wilkins' sentencing hearing, Cobb County Superior Court Judge Tame Kell characterized Marlissa's murder as, quote, as gruesome and as brutal a crime as I've ever seen. The judge imposed life imprisonment on Wilkins for malice murder, plus a consecutive 20-year term for aggravated battery. Under Georgia law, the other charges were merged or vacated, and Wilkins cannot seek parole until he has completed at least 30 years of his sentence. For Marlissa's family, though, no punishment could ever restore what had been taken away from them. At the sentencing hearing, her loved ones described the immeasurable grief they had carried since January 19, 2008, through all the years that followed. One of the most painful moments came from Marlissa's grandfather, Marvin, who revealed that for a full year following her death, he kept paying her cell phone bill so he could dial her number and hear the sound of her voice on the voicemail greeting. It was a small gesture rooted in unimaginable sorrow. Although the family openly discussed the suffering caused by Matthew's actions, they also offered forgiveness, saying they hoped that someday he would forgive himself. Still, nothing could ever return Marlissa to them. She was only 16 years old. She had dreamed of going to college. She had dreamed of writing songs. She had dreamed of creating a life that was completely and entirely her own. Those dreams ended on January 19, 2008. For everyone who loved Marlissa, the grief of losing her did not disappear after Matthew Wilkins' conviction. It remains in the birthdays she never got to celebrate, the milestones she never experienced, and the life she never had the opportunity to create for herself. Today, Marlissa is remembered as far more than the tragedy that ended her life. She was a deeply loved granddaughter, a gifted young woman with extraordinary talent, and a 16-year-old who deserved the chance to grow up. Instead, her story remains a painful reminder of how swiftly violence can take away not only a life, but all the hopes and possibilities contained within it. For everyone who loves Marlissa Wells, that absence is something they will carry with them forever. My Marlissa Wells. People throughout Germany are grieving while also demanding explanations this week after a Berlin Pride celebration became the scene of an alleged Islamist extremist attack that claimed 1 life and injured nearly 36 others, and it has since emerged that the suspect had an earlier history of radicalization and terrorism-related crimes. The attack unfolded during the evening of July 25th as hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Berlin for Christopher Street Day, one of Europe's largest LGBTQ pride celebrations. Following the parade's conclusion, many participants remained in Tiergarten Park near the Brandenburg Gate for concerts and celebrations. However, at approximately 10 p.m, police received reports that a white van had driven into a crowd along a wooded pathway through the park, situated only a short distance from the main Pride festivities. Investigators say the vehicle hit numerous pedestrians before crashing into a tree. The horrifying violence continued moments later, when the male driver allegedly exited the vehicle and started stabbing and slashing additional victims with a large bladed weapon that many reports identified as a machete. The attack left one woman dead and at least 29 other people wounded. Several victims sustained serious injuries, although officials later stated none of the survivors were believed to be in life-threatening condition. The annual Pride event was cancelled immediately. While performers were still on stage, organisers halted the festivities and urged the massive crowd to calmly exit the area. The word evacuation was projected across the main stage while emergency vehicles poured into the park. Police quickly located the rented white van believed to have been used during the attack, but by then the suspect had already escaped. Within hours, authorities identified the suspect as a man with Islamist extremist connections and widened the search across the entire city, deploying thousands of officers together with specialized tactical units. Police later identified the suspect as 21-year-old Abdul Balut, a German citizen of Lebanese descent. The manhunt concluded at approximately 6 p.m. the following day when officers located Balut at a garden complex in Berlin's Spandau district. Police say that as members of a specialized tactical unit approached him, Balut suddenly charged toward them carrying a knife. Officers opened fire, striking the 21-year-old. Despite emergency medical treatment at the scene, he was pronounced dead. This is where the situation becomes especially controversial because, according to prosecutors, Balut had been known to authorities for years. Court records show he had previous convictions for assault and robbery before eventually becoming radicalized. Investigators say that in 2025, Balut traveled through Turkey to Lebanon intending to join the Islamic State group in Syria. While there, he contacted individuals he believed were ISIS members before being arrested by Lebanese authorities and sentenced to 3 months in prison for inciting religious and sectarian conflict. After returning to Germany later that year, Balut was arrested once more and placed in pretrial detention. Only 2 months before the attack, he received a sentence of 1 year and 10 months in prison for preparing a serious act of violence endangering the state. However, because the case was prosecuted under Germany's juvenile justice system, the sentence was suspended. Prosecutors appealed that ruling, seeking a longer custodial sentence, but meanwhile, Balut was released under the supervision of a probation officer. That decision has since triggered widespread debate and public outrage across Germany, with many demanding to know why a convicted extremist had been permitted to remain free when the attack occurred. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz condemned the attack as heinous, while Interior Minister Alexander Dobrindt described the violence as a suspected Islamist terror attack and pledged stronger security measures, including expanded monitoring of individuals regarded as security threats. Meanwhile, members of Berlin's LGBTQ community returned to the Brandenburg Gate the following day to hold a vigil for the victims, placing flowers, candles, and rainbow flags while pledging the attack would not weaken the community's visibility or determination. Every case leaves questions behind. What's your verdict? If you enjoyed this investigation, like the video and subscribe to Crime Scene Files for more true crime stories. Tell me your theory and where you're watching from in the comments now. Click the next case on your screen, because the truth is never as simple as it seems.